Hello everyone, my name is Brad Weber. I am the owner and head baker at Top Knot Artisan Bakery. I think the number one question that I always get is how to make sourdough starter. What is your sourdough starter recipe? Instead of doing this on Instagram or Facebook or anything like that, where I only have like a minute and a half to explain it, I actually want to do this on YouTube so I have unlimited amount of time because I think that there's a lot of questions that could need to be answered. There's a lot of steps involved, and I don't want to just fit it into 90 seconds. So this is going to be a longer format video, but I hope that it answers a lot of questions that you might have. So let's get started. So there's a couple things to look out for whenever you're making sourdough starter. Number one, you want to make sure you're using unbleached flour. It doesn't really matter what kind of flour you're using. You can use whole wheat, all-purpose, bread flour, rye flour, whatever it is to make a starter. In my opinion, I think it's best to use all-purpose flour. I use King Arthur's all-purpose flour. It's in a red bag. You can buy it anywhere in any grocery store, or if you go to my link tree on my website, you'll be able to see that I have a link for it in my link tree right at the top. And they ship all over the United States. The second thing that you need to look out for is temperature. So if your starter is very cold, like you keep it in the refrigerator, it's not going to be very active and it's kind of unpredictable. You want to find a nice environment in your house to keep it where you know that the temperature is always going to be the same and it's not going to fluctuate very much and it's not going to get too hot or too cold. So if you keep it in front of a window sill, it might get very, very hot. If you keep it somewhere, in the dark, it might get too cold. So find somewhere that's between 70 and 75 degrees. That would be the ideal temperature. The one thing that's going to kill a starter is heat. You don't want it to get too hot, and I mean like 90 degrees plus. That's going to be way too hot for a starter. The third thing that you need to keep in mind is consistency. So in all things with sourdough starter, you want to make sure you're consistent. That means with feedings, you want to make sure you're weighing them, but to the gram, so you know exactly how much you're using. If you're weighing them with volume, meaning like cups or tablespoons, that is not an accurate measurement. Yes, I know that people were doing this way before we had scales, but we do have scales now, so we should use them. And I think it's way more accurate and way more consistent to use exact values whenever you're making your starters, especially in the beginning, because that's when your starter is most fragile. When you're using a more mature starter, you can be kind of looser with your feedings and it's gonna be just fine. But in the beginning, make sure you're weighing them. The other thing is you wanna make sure that you're feeding your starter at the right times. So feed your starter only when it has ripened, meaning that it has risen all the way as high as it's gonna go and now it's starting to descend. While it's on its way down from the peak, all the way to where it's all the way down on the bottom and it's very liquidy, kind of like this. Okay, that's a ripe starter. It's very liquidy, needs to be fed. From the peak all the way to the bottom is about 8 hours, so you have a long time to either feed it or to use it to make bread with. So you don't need to use it right whenever it's at its peak, but you do need to wait until after it has peaked. And then after it's peaked until it's all the way down at the bottom and it's completely ripened, you can use it to make bread with, or you can feed it again. The one thing you don't want to do is overfeed your starter. That's where a lot of people go wrong. They think that they should, it's not thick enough, or maybe it's too thick. And we add a little bit of water, a little bit of flour. Just trust the process, stick to your weighings. Only feed your starter one time a day. The only time that I ever feed my starter more than once is whenever I'm using it in the morning to make bread. I feed it right after I use it to make bread, and then at nighttime, I'm gonna make bread again, so I feed it again. That's the only time that I use it twice in the same day. So I'm gonna draw this out. I'm a visual person. I hope maybe some of you are visual people, but I think that seeing it helps you kind of understand the process instead of showing you the finished product. So let's just walk through this real slow. So you have a jar, okay? Here's your jar. On day one, you're gonna add, and I'll do different colors so then we can differentiate how much we know. Red is gonna be flour, blue is gonna be water. On day one, you're gonna add 100 grams of flour. Okay? And 100 grams of water to a jar. Mix that up until it becomes a thick paste. And I'll show you what a thick paste means. I'll clip in a little clip right here. And you're gonna have a very thick paste. Okay, it doesn't need to be anything crazy. Once you get to about this type of consistency, that's fine. Anyway, so now that you've mixed that up into a thick paste, you're gonna cover that up with a paper towel or something loose, like a cloth. You don't want it to be airtight, and let that sit someplace warm for 24 hours. And what I mean by warm is somewhere between 70 and 75 degrees. The one thing that will kill a starter is heat. So you wanna make sure it doesn't get anywhere above like 85 to 90 degrees. Anything below that, like colder, it's gonna be just fine. It's just gonna rise a lot slower. So now that you've let that sit for 24 hours, you're not gonna see a lot of activity, but we're gonna take what we started with and we're gonna move it into another jar. And this is the first time that you're gonna discard. So get another jar. This is now day 2. So on day 1, we have 200 grams total in here of starter. On day 2, you're gonna dump 100 grams of starter from your jar on day 1 into a new jar on day 2. And you're gonna feed that 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, which would give you a total of 300 grams in this jar. Mix that up and let that sit for 24 hours. Same thing, just let it do its thing. At this point, it would be good practice for you to put a rubber band or a hair bow or some sort of indicator to let you know where your starter starts at, and then where you'll be able to see if your starter has doubled or tripled in size, so you'll know where it ends at the next day. Okay? This over here that you have left is called your discard. Discard is a pretty weird concept for a lot of people when it comes to sourdough starter. So every time you feed your starter, you're gonna dump a little bit out. That's just the reality of it. If you don't discard, you're gonna end up with way too much starter. Also, when you discard, you know how much starter you're gonna have left to feed. If you don't discard, it's gonna be really hard to keep track of it. That's why I use 2 containers. So I'm gonna erase this first one on day 1 so we can stop worrying about this. So on day 2, you have your starter, you've mixed it together, you've let it sit for 24 hours. It's now risen a little bit. You'll probably be able to see a little bit of activity. It's starting to fall, and you're gonna feed it again. So you have 300 grams in here, okay? This 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of starter is 300 grams total. On day 3, this is where you have an option. Either you can dump out 200 grams from this first jar and just use the same jar over and over and over again, or if you want to be accurate, you can dump 100 grams of starter into this new jar, and then what is left in your day 2 jar, your discard, you can either throw that away or you can make this your permanent discard jar, meaning that every time you feed this new jar, you're dumping it into here. And then that way you'll know how much you're discarding every single day, and you can just use the same jar to feed it every single day. People ask me a lot of the time, how many jars do you need to make starter? The answer is 2. You need 1 jar to hold your starter and 1 jar to discard in, unless if you choose to discard it directly into the trash. That's totally up to you. So anyway, on day 2, you've got 300 grams in here. It's now risen, fallen. You're gonna feed it again. Day 3, you're putting 100 grams from day 2 into the day 3 jar. And you're gonna feed it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. And that's it. Every single day from here on out, you're gonna do the exact same thing. You're gonna discard either into your discard jar or the trash, and what you have left over, you're gonna feed it equal parts flour and water. Now this amount that you choose to keep is totally up to you. I'm using 100 grams because I think having 300 grams of starter is just a good practice. Each loaf of sourdough that you make requires about 100 grams of starter. So this jar is enough to make 2 loaves of sourdough and also have 100 grams left over. But this ratio right here is 1 to 1 to 1. So that means the first number right here is your starter. The second number is your flour. And the third number is your water. That's a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio of starter, flour, water. This can be 50 grams, 50 grams, 50 grams, whatever you choose it to be. But this ratio is a very small feeding, meaning that it's equal parts starter, flour, water. It's gonna take your starter about 8 to 12 hours to be able to eat through this entire thing, meaning that it's gonna eat all the way to the top, rise all the way as high as it's gonna go, and start to descend a little bit. The only time that you would change this is if you're trying to adjust how long it takes for your starter to rise. Now, after a while, your starter might eat through a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio very quickly. Like in 6 hours, it's doubled, it's ready to bake with. That might be too quick for you. So change this to a 1 to 2 to 2 ratio, or even a 1 to 3 to 3 ratio, meaning if you're gonna use 100 grams of water or starter, use 200 grams of flour, 200 grams of water. This ratio, the starter ratio, all you're doing with that is just controlling how long it's gonna take for your starter to rise. Keeping your ratio small, a 1 to 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 to 2, you're building strength in your starter. You know that within 24 hours maximum, your starter is gonna completely eat all the way through that meal and descend all the way back down. And you can feed it every day that way. Some people who, do 1 to 5 to 5 or something like that, that's way too high of a ratio. In my opinion, it's gonna take your starter a long time to eat all the way through that. It's better just to keep it small. The one mistake that most people make whenever they're doing a sourdough starter is they overfeed it. They do 2 or even 3 feedings in a day. That's not necessary. The max that you should feed your starter is 1 a day, maybe twice. And the only time I feed my starter twice a day is whenever I'm going to use it in the morning for bread. And then I feed it in the morning right after I make my dough, and it rises all day long. And then I use it again at night to make bread. So I'm making bread twice in the middle during the day. Other than that, just feed it 1 time. So now you have a healthy starter, and it's rising every single day. It's very predictable, it's very active, and you want to make bread. This is how you're going to do it. So if you've been following my directions and feeding your starter 1 to 1 to 1 ratio each day, you'll know how much starter you have in here. Let's just say you're using 100 grams for each of those values. That means you'll have 300 grams of starter in this first jar. Okay? You're gonna make what's called a leaven, not like the number 11, but a leaven, some people call it, or levain. It just depends how you pronounce it. All that is a separate container that holds your starter. So whenever you go to discard your starter in the morning or whenever it's ready to be fed, discard it into another jar. Let's say you're going to discard off 200 grams into this jar, which would leave you with 100 grams of starter left in this jar that you can feed another 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, and keep this starter separated so that you're not going to use this to make bread with. You can just keep feeding this every single day. You discard 200 grams into this, and you're going to feed that equal parts flour and water. 200 grams, 200 grams, which would give you 600 grams of starter in a new container. So 600 grams of starter is enough for you to make 6 loaves of bread with, technically. So you can do this with any amount that you need. But all you're doing with this leaven is making exactly as much starter as you need to make bread with, so that you don't have to worry about using your main mother starter to make bread. You're just making it into a separate container so that this is all you're using to make bread with. Okay, how do you know when you need to feed your starter? This is very exaggerated, but I'm just showing you, so like drawing it so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So your starter, this is the peak, okay? This is where it has maxed out. It's as high as it's gonna get. When it starts to go down, that means it's ripening and it's finished eating. All the air that's inside of it, the CO2 is being released. It's starting to decrease in size and go back down. You can see on the side of the jar, there's streaks going down it. It's clear. It's on its way down. While it's doing that, you can either feed it again and be done with it, or you can use it to make bread. And you don't want to use it before it has peaked to make bread, or feed it again before it has peaked. That's whenever you overfeed it. So wait until it's gone all the way to its peak and it started to go back down before you use it to make bread, or you want to feed it again. So to make sourdough starter, you're definitely going to need a couple of things. The first thing you're going to need is a good scale, one that can read in grams. So this is a pretty nice scale that I have invested in. I like it because it has a flat top and it's all one piece. It's easy to clean. It's always covered in some sort of sourdough starter or flour. But anyway, you need a nice scale. That's step number one. Step number two is you need a mason jar or some sort of container to hold all your sourdough starter in. So I like to use mason jars because they come with this cap that you can put on top. Whenever you're done mixing your sourdough starter, it's always good to cover it. One thing you need to keep in mind is you don't want it to be airtight. So a lot of these will come with some sort of rubber gasket that goes over top. I take that out and I just use a paper towel and I cover that up and screw the lid on. So keep these two things. You don't need the other part. One other thing that you're gonna need, I guess two other things, is flour and water. So the most important part with the water is just to make sure it's room temperature. People always ask me, does it need to be unfiltered, filtered? Can you just use tap water? I really don't I don't mind at all. I just take my stuff right from the sink. I use that. I make sure it's about 75 degrees. If I really want to, take it super serious, I'll leave it on the counter for a while to make sure it's room temperature. The thing that I worry about the most though is the flour. So flour, you want to make sure you use King Arthur's all-purpose or any sort of unbleached flour. If you use a bleached all-purpose flour, that's going to kill your starter before it even gets started. So people will ask me a lot of the time, can I use rye or can I use whole wheat flour or something like that? Yes, you can. But to get the results you need to have a strong starter in the beginning, I think it's best to use an all-purpose flour. And like I said, King Arthur has been my tried and true flour. I use it for, all of my starters. I've used it since the beginning. Their whole wheat is great. You can also purchase their organic flours as well if that's something you're concerned about, but all-purpose flour and water. So to start your starter off with, on day number 1, you're gonna mix together. This is 100 grams weighed out and 100 grams. So 100 grams water, 100 grams flour. I always do my liquid first so that the flour doesn't stick to the bottom, and then do your flour. And of course, you just want to spill a little bit of it too. That's really important. Anyway, mix this together and you're gonna have a very thick paste. Okay, it doesn't need to be anything crazy. Once you get to about this type of consistency, that's fine. And that's it. That's all you need to do on day number 1. Once you mix that together, take your paper towel, cover it up, and then let that sit for 24 hours. Don't feed it anymore, just leave it like that. You can mark it if you'd like, just to know where it is, and then you can see how much it's risen in 24 hours, but really on this first feeding, you're not gonna get much rise out of it, so don't worry about that too much. But in the future, I usually use like a headband or a rubber band or something like that to mark where it is before I fed it, so then I know how much it's rose. On day 2, it's gonna look like this. So you can see it's a lot more watery. It has ripened. That is the right term for this. So after about 24 hours, maybe 36 hours, depending on how long you wait, it's going to be very, very liquidy, and that means that it needs to be fed. If you smell it, it's going to smell very acidic and not really like bread. But anyway, the best thing that you could do is take your first jar. This is for demonstration purposes, so I have them both prepared already. This has 200 grams in here, okay? 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour. You're gonna dump 100 grams from this jar into a new jar, okay? So you have 100 grams of starter in this new jar. That leaves you with 100 grams of discard in this jar. Every single day, you're gonna repeat this process. You're always gonna have some discard whenever you're feeding your starter. You cannot not discard, or else you'll end up with way too much starter. And at the end of the day, you know, that it is what it is. So I take 100 grams from this jar on day 1, put it into a new jar. The stuff that's left in here, you can either throw it away, or you can just make this your permanent discard jar. And then every day, whenever you're going to feed your second jar, this jar, dump it into this jar and just make this your permanent discard jar. And how you know how much you have in here is because now there's 100 grams. We're gonna feed it 100 grams flour, 100 grams water. So that means there'll be 300 grams in here. Whenever you discard, put this one on the scale, okay? And then dump this jar into there. So now as you're discarding your starter each day, you're weighing how much you're discarding. You'll know how much is left because you know how much you're feeding each day. Every day you're gonna feed it a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. So that's gonna be 100 grams flour, 100 grams water, 100 grams starter. So at the end of the day, making a starter is not really that complicated. People make it a lot harder than it needs to be. You just need to be patient, trust the process, stick to these rules that you've put into place, and within 7 to 10 days, you're gonna have a starter that is strong enough to make bread with.